Okay, thanks, Jason, for inviting me. And yeah, so I'm really glad that I can actually finally give this presentation. And today I'm going to go over a couple of studies which my lab have been doing over the last 5 years, where we really started to investigate the influence of reward on motor performance and trying to understand some of the mechanisms involved with these effects. So reward appears to have, or does have, a remarkable ability to enhance motor behaviour, specifically in humans. And I'm going to go over a couple of the studies which I've based a lot of my work on. And in effect, what it seems to do is allow individuals to execute actions with increased accuracy and speed. And in effect, it breaks the speed-accuracy trade-off. So this is a nice figure from one of Sanjay Manohar's studies, which is showing the general relationship between accuracy and speed. And I'm sure, as you're all aware, the faster you move, the less accurate you generally are. And a representation of skill, well, some people often think of representation of skill as a shift in the speed-accuracy trade-off. So you can not only perform an action with greater speed, but you can also perform it with greater accuracy. And the kind of questions around this, that the idea is that the faster, more accurate you move, the more costly this performance is. And we're going to go into some of these costs in a few slides. And kind of showing these studies, there's been a lot of work on this over the last 5 to 10 years. And what people have generally done is get people, so this is a study by Summerside et al., so Alan Ahmed's group, and they got participants to make reaching movements to 4 quadrants. And at any one time, one of these quadrants was rewarded. And it's rewarded for, I think, the speed of your movement, or it actually, maybe the reward wasn't actually even contingent on your performance. So just when you made a move towards that particular quadrant, you got rewarded for that particular action. And we're trying to compare the rewarded versus non-rewarded movements. And what Summerside showed was that there's very, very consistent performance across participants, where participants made larger movements, so which we can see here, but also faster movements. And apart from one participant, this effect was amazingly consistent. And what they suggested is that reward discounts the cost of effort. So these movements are more effortful because you're moving faster and making larger movements. And to make those movements, you have to have a reward available to pay the cost of this enhanced metabolic cost. Another study which we've really liked in the lab is the work by Sanjay Manohar, and they got participants to make saccades towards these targets. And they were looking at the effective reward on both motor execution, but also target selection. So they got participants to look at a particular target. Sometimes a distractor would appear where they had to inhibit their movement towards the distractor, and then the relevant target would appear and they had to make a saccade towards that target. The reward that they got was based on reaction time. What we can see is kind of examples of performance here. So this is a movement where they've been distracted and then make the corrective movement, and this is movements where, for example, being able to inhibit that movement and make a straight saccade to the relevant target. And they were looking at both speed and accuracy. So for execution, there was velocity and endpoint variability, and for selection, there was reaction time and distraction errors. And what Sanjay showed was, again, this very, very consistent effect on performance, where reward broke the speed accuracy trade-off. So we can see it as individual parameters over here, where across the 0, 10, 50p trials, participants moved faster, were less variable, and actually more accurate as well. And if you combine this on a trial-by-trial basis, what we can clearly see is that the reward trials were performed with greater speed, but also accuracy. And you actually have this linear relationship, as the more money provided, or the more reward, the greater effect and performance that we could see. And again, with this, another way to look at this is with the kind of speed accuracy trade-off curves. You can kind of see the shift in speed and accuracy. And so there's one key thing to remember for these kind of trials or movements is that it's not really learning dependent. So this is trial by trial, where on some trials participants got 50p, and other trials they didn't. So it's kind of this very instantaneous effect of reward, which has an effect on that trial. And the Summerside study actually showed this, where then on the next trial, these effects are completely lost. So it's a very transient, instantaneous effect, but it doesn't kind of last post reward. And what Sanjay started to look at is the underlying mechanisms for these effects of reward. And what Sanjay suggested was that one of the costs for this enhanced performance is greater online correction. And so this is a bit of a messy or busy slide. And he developed, I suppose, a relatively complex way of looking at online corrections. Well, I suppose a different way than what often people look at. So what they looked at is the kind of the time correlations across trajectories of a particular position time t, and correlated that with all other positions at time t plus 1. And what you get is these kind of time correlations that we can see here, with the suggestion that if movements are stereotyped across trials, the correlation will be high because the early position provide a large amount of information about the later position. And what that suggests is that this kind of very just a feed forward movement. There's very little online correction. So where you start off moving early on in your movement is very predictive of where you end up at the end of your movement, suggesting this kind of very linear trajectory. However, if you see online correction, then the trajectories early on are going to be very uncorrelated with where you end up, because of you're basically performing online feedback, and this is going to be very much dependent on the random error on a given trial. So these time correlations are really a way to look at the amount of online correction. A large amount of correlation would suggest very little correction. Reduced correlation would suggest, this is shown here by these kind of blue areas, would reflect a lot of online correction occurring within movements. And what Sanjay did compared these time correlations with reward versus no reward trials. And what he found was that you got this is just so you either get this is a comparison between, I think, 50p and 0p trials. Red is representative of increased correlation, blue is decreased correlation, and these kind of white lines are indicating significant changes. And what Sanjay is suggesting here is that reward leads to an increase in online correction, as represented by these blue areas here. So Sanjay's kind of conclusions from this work was that reward enhances performance, and the reason why it allows you to enhance performance is because it's allowing you to have a great amount of online correction, meaning that you can move faster but also more accurate. And that these, even though there isn't a huge amount of work on this, he's suggesting that these online corrections are metabolically demanding, and so you need reward, or the presence of reward, in order to pay the cost of this enhanced online correction, kind of the cost of inhibiting noise. So this is where we started from, and what my PhD student, or previous PhD student, was working on was other potential mechanisms that reward could be working on in order to allow you to move not only faster but more accurate in the presence of reward. The kind of question that we were suggesting, why don't we move like this all the time? One is cost of feedback. Another potential mechanism is arm stiffness. So it's a relatively, sorry, I'll go through this. So arm stiffness is a relatively simple way of decreasing noise in your arm and allowing you to be more accurate. Big problem about increased arm stiffness, if you do it yourself, is it's very energetically demanding. So if you start making these movements and you co-contract your muscles, you get tired very, very quickly. Obviously, with saccades, there's less of an opportunity for this for stiffness to be in it, to be a potential mechanism. But specifically in reaching, Ollie thought that a way that reward could be enhancing performance is through, I suppose, a more simple increase in stiffness. And so this is what Ollie wanted to look at with reaching movements. So we did a similar study to Sanjay, where we looked at selection and execution within reaching movements. So we got people to sit in front of a robotic manipulum, a target. They'd move into the start position, and they'd get informed what trials this was going to be. So 0, 10, or 50p trials. A target would appear. They had to make a reaching movement towards a target. And in a reward trial, the reward was based on a combination of reaction time and movement time. It's a closed loop design, so it's kind of based in the last 20 trials. And so it's always trying to push them to move faster. We also had these distractor trials where people move towards the start position. A target with which was a different color would appear that inhibit that movement and wait for the correct target to appear. So we're looking at selection and execution, but in reaching movements. And in general, we replicated the Sanjay, Manhar, and work in that. So for selection, this is the difference between 0p and 10 and 50p trials. So we get an improvement in selection accuracy across both reward contexts and a decrease in reaction time. And across participants, we can create these kind of speed accuracy trade-off curves. And what we can see is that across our participants, we see an improvement in reaction time and selection accuracy with reward. One thing which we didn't see is a difference between 10 and 50p trials. So reward had an effect, and it broke the speed accuracy trade-off in terms of selection, but these effects were relatively consistent across our 10 and 50p trials. We saw, again, similar effects in terms of execution. So for peak velocity and movement time, we saw an increase in peak velocity, a decrease in movement time. Our changes in spatial accuracy weren't, I suppose, as robust as Sanjay Manhar's work, but we did see a decrease in angular error, but not radial error. And if you combine these two parameters, overall, we see this kind of shift in the speed accuracy trade-off, where people are moving faster and more accurate with reward when reaching versus 0p trials. Yep. So one other thing which I'm going to go back to, just because the second study, is whether we saw any differences in terms of punishment. So in this context, the faster people moved, the less money they lost. So they would start with £10 and reward, they could earn money. In the punishment, they could avoid losing money by moving faster and faster. And what we can see is that overall, in terms of selection and execution, we see a general similarity in terms of effect, where they broke, again, the speed accuracy trade-off in punishment trials versus kind of 0p trials. But one thing, when we compare the reward versus punishment, and these kind of 50p trials, so the brown is the 50p trials and the green is the minus 50p trials, but we actually get a slightly larger effect in the punishment than we do the reward. So it seems that maybe generally that participants are more sensitive to punishment than they are reward. And we, in the paper, we suggest that this may be something to do with loss aversion, but I'll come back to that in the second study, which I'll describe. The first thing that we wanted to do in terms of these results, so in terms of the actual behaviour, I think we get very similar stuff to Sanjay in terms of reaching movements. We wanted to firstly look if we could replicate the time-time correlation analysis and see if we also see an increase in feedback control during these movements. So we did these time-time correlations. Just to confuse you, Ollie flipped them and did them the other way. I'm not sure why, but so this is for the Sanjay work, this is the start of the movement and this is the end of the movement. For Ollie, this is the start of the movement and this is the end of the movement. I have no idea why he switched it, but there we go. So these are the time-time correlations, and we compared across all our different experiments, the reward versus unrewarded. And I suppose the first thing that we can say is that we do replicate them across some of the, so this is when all the cohorts are combined. So I suppose this is the one to really focus on. And again, the black lines are the significant differences. But we do see an increase or a decrease in the correlation, suggesting an increase in feedback control with reward. So, so one aspect of it is we do replicate the Sanjay Manohar, where we see an increase in feedback control with reward trials. But what we do also see is this increase in correlation towards the end of the movement. The increase in correlation is suggestive of a decrease in noise. And we're really interested in what could be representing this increase in correlation at the start. So what it suggests is that it's becoming, there's less noise at the end of the movement, and we were interested in what was causing this increase in correlation here. What Ollie suggested was that this was representing an increase in stiffness. So he wanted to model this first before we actually did the behaviour. Please email Ollie in terms of this modelling, because he really knows the details. But he performed simulations using a simplified control system. Again, we were collaborating with Sanjay on this, and we basically evaluated how it responded to hypothesized manipulations of the control system. And we had all these different models where we had just a general noise reduction, high feedback control, late feedback control. And what we found is that when we had high feedback during the movement and a late noise reduction, we could replicate our results, where we get a decrease in correlation during the movement and an increase in correlation at the end. Just to show that across our different experiments, that this model was the winning model. So it is relatively consistent in terms of the fact that across all the experiments that we did, the effects of reward could really be represented in terms of these autocorrelation results as being an increase in feedback control during the movement, and then another mechanism causing an increase in correlation at the end. But we haven't explained what this increase in correlation is yet. So again, what Ollie suggests is that this increase in stiffness, this increase in correlation at the end, represented an increase in endpoint stiffness. So with a robotic manipulandum, you can actually assess stiffness. We can't assess you can assess co-contraction by doing EMG, and that's what Ollie's been trying to do during his postdoc in Canada. But we can also, I suppose, indirectly assess the stiffness of the arm by using this really nice technique explained by Celine et al. In 2009. And what we've got participants to do is they were making reaching movements with reward or no reward. Once they got into the target, we then provide these 300 millisecond bumps in 8 different directions. And the bumps were basically trying to force the handle 8 centimeters in these altered directions. And we were assessing how much resistance there was to the perturbation in these 8 different directions. And the amount of resistance has been shown to be a good representation of arm stiffness. And what we can get is we can get these nice stiffness arrays, which we can then assess in reward versus no reward context. So this is what we did. Again, we reduced it to either having a target here or a target here, reward versus no reward, and then we had these bumps assessing stiffness. So Ollie created these stiffness ellipses, and again, just to reiterate, we had one target here, one target here, and we assessed the size of these, or the area of these ellipses. And what you can hopefully see is that we get an increase in stiffness across the reward versus no reward trials, and it's directionally specific. So it's actually towards the target that they're moving towards. One possibility, though, is that the increase in stiffness is simply because they're moving faster. So there's a relatively high correlation between stiffness and velocity. So we just wanted to see whether these results could be explained by simply people moving faster in the reward context. So Ollie did a mixed effects linear model to try to see what explained the increase in area. And I suppose interestingly to us was that velocity couldn't explain the increase in global stiffness while reward could. So what this result suggested to us or represented was that even if we were to look at a trial had a very, very similar velocity in the reward versus no reward context, the reward trial would have an increase in stiffness, even though they were moving at the same speed. So this seems to suggest to us that reward was associated with participants' increase in stiffness. Now, we suggest in the paper that this is because, well, likely due to co-contraction, but that's just an assumption. We didn't actually assess that. So there's one other key thing is that we didn't see similar results at the beginning of the movement. Again, supporting our model that this increase in stiffness only really happened at the end of the movement. We did try to assess this during the movement, but it was exceptionally hard, and in essence, we failed to program these bumps happening in a meaningful way during the movement. And again, what our model would predict that we wouldn't see this increase in stiffness during the movement, we'd only see it at the end, but we weren't able to actually test that prediction. So interim summary from this work was that reward improves performance during simple reaching movements as reflected by a shift in the speed axis function. We believe this represents the vigor-related effects of reward. So this is not learning dependent, it's very much transient effects. Sanjay has shown that it's dopamine dependent. He tested Parkinson's disease patients, and at least with the saccade effects, but these effects of reward are not seen. So in essence, you see a flat line when you look at the velocity effects in Parkinson's disease patients. But yeah, it's not learning dependent, it really is transient. We believe the improvements are associated with increased online feedback and endpoint stiffness. There's multiple mechanisms that reward is working on. It seems to suggest that reward pays the cost, metabolic or cognitive cost of enhanced performance. And there's likely a reason why people don't perform like this normally. We're now assessing this task in stroke patients. N of 1, we literally tested our first patient a few weeks ago. And this is just to show that in age-matched control, we see the effects of reward in the healthy control, and just literally in one stroke patient. Really surprisingly for this patient is that we don't see an effect of reward. The whole prediction of this is that we're not really expecting stroke patients to show a different sensitivity to reward. The reason why we wanted to use reward in these stroke patients is to really push or assess what their ceiling was, because what's been shown is that when they go into this 3-week rehabilitation, that we get these huge improvements in clinical scores, but we don't really know if it's just the rehab is actually making them perform at a level which they could never perform before, or if it's just allowing them to reach their ceiling, which they already had to begin with, but they just weren't using their capacity. But what it suggests here is, at least in some of these patients, that the sensitivity to reward has been altered. But we're going to be testing between 30 to 50 patients before and after this rehabilitation. So on this task, so one question is, what's the sensitivity to reward? But then also, how does the intervention influence their behaviour? So that's kind of finishing that side of this talk. The second side of it is to really assess participant sensitivity to reward and punishment in a little bit more detail, and the relationship between effort and reward and punishment. And this is work which Julie Chen, who is a postdoc in my lab, was doing. And it was kind of, again, she comes from a decision-making background, and she very interested in reinforcement learning and people's sensitivity to reward. And so we wanted to look at these kind of questions, but in a motor context. There's been some central interest in how costs such as delay or reward uncertainty discounts the value of an individual associates the beneficial outcome of a decision. So again, just in terms of decision-making and economic decision-making, in these kind of tasks, individuals show a very clear tendency to avoid punishment rather than to acquire reward, so loss aversion. this is an extremely consistent and powerful effect. And in effect, there's a kind of, the relationship is about 2.5 times. You have to offer about 2.5 times more reward than you do punishment, there to be a kind of similar term 50-50 decision-making context. And there's been a lot of work now looking at these decision-making process in terms of the cost of physical effort, but there wasn't really much work at comparing reward versus punishment and the context of loss aversion within effort-based decision-making. So this is what Julie set out to look at. And it's kind of interesting because, and I'll come back to it, because some of the results that we've found when we've looked at reward versus punishment, it does seem to be differences where participants do show an increased sensitivity to punishment in comparison to reward. But it was always kind of just hand wavy, oh, this is loss aversion. We didn't actually know if this was really true in effort-based decision-making in a motor context. So this is the task that we set up, where participants were looking at a screen and were holding 2 force controllers, and we weren't holding it with their hands. We were just basically getting them to push these controllers with their index fingers. And we asked participants to make maximum voluntary contractions with their index fingers. And based on that, we then got them to do reward and punishment decision-making trials. So in a reward context, they got offered a particular amount of reward to produce a certain amount of effort. So here, I think this is about 60% of the maximum voluntary contraction. So they could either perform the task, and if they were successful, they got a particular reward, or they could skip it and get 0 points. And then this is the actual development of the trial, where they did the choice. They either had to execute it or wait. There's a similar temporal component, and then they got their feedback. Then in the punishment context, they could either perform the task to get 0 points, or if they were to skip it, they would get a particular punishment, so -25. So we try to have a punishment and reward context. One key thing is that this task was actually very, very tiring. So to perform 100% of the maximum voluntary contraction with your index finger was very tiring for the participants. And we assessed these decisions in young healthy participants, older healthy participants, and Parkinson's disease patients, but they were on doping medication, which I suppose is a key aspect in light of our results. So the first thing just to show you is that participant or PD patients could actually perform the task. So this is just an example of the force levels. So this is, I think level 6 was 70% of maximum voluntary contraction. So again, similar to what other people have shown, that PD patients can perform these effortful tasks given the opportunity, and actually they look very, very similar to the other two groups. Just one thing is that all groups overestimated the effort, and this is because I think if they went below this level for a certain period of time, they failed. They wanted a bit of capacity to this is also just to reflect that there's a strong correlation against the peak force versus required effort. So overall, all the groups could perform this task or perform the effort required relatively well. Then just to go through how we assessed or how we got an indifference point. So we this is an example of a reward and punishment trial on a particular level, and we use a staircase algorithm to determine at a particular level how many points we had to offer in order for us to get a kind of 50-50 decision-making level. And so what we have here is just an example of participants' performance, where they either decide to reject or accept to perform the effort. And then we applied a sigmoid curve, and then the 50-50 cross line was our indifference point. It's a relatively simple way of looking at decision making, and very similar to what they do in decision making literature. So then we did this for reward and punishment across our different levels, and we can then plot them like so. And hopefully what's very, very clear is that apart from the low levels of force, we get a clear separation between reward and punishment trials, which is relatively consistent across all our participants. So this is young healthy participants. And what we can see is that loss aversion is very, very clear. So the loss aversion index was an average of these values for each participant, and then we made a ratio between punishment and reward. Any value over 1 indicates that participants were more sensitive to punishment than they were reward. And again, you can clearly see that as the forces increase, we needed to offer less punishment in comparison to reward in order for people to take on that effortful task. And apart from a couple of participants, we observed some level of loss aversion. So we think it's a really consistent effect. So what do we see in older healthy participants and PD patients? Well, across both, we observed, again, clear loss aversion. So there's always a difference, generally, apart from a few participants, between reward and punishment. If anything, in the older healthy participants, we saw an increase in loss aversion in comparison to the young participants, where there's kind of a very, very clear difference where they really didn't need to offer very much punishment in order for them to take on these effortful tasks. But what's also clear is that we get in comparison to the age-matched controls, we get a decrease in loss aversion in the PD patients. And what's hopefully a bit, which will become clearer in further analysis, is that the reward actually looks relatively similar across these two groups, but it's actually the punishment which has been altered, where they're showing less sensitivity to punishment in comparison to the healthy control participants. So obviously we can look at this by separating the different points between the reward and punishment trials. And what we can see is that, again, remember these are medicated Parkinson's disease patients. They show they show the same sensitivity to reward, but show a decreased sensitivity to punishment. So the healthy controls needed less punishment offering to go and perform the effortful task. PD patients needed more points in a punishment context. So one possibility is that how they're making these decisions is different across the groups. So what we did is we modeled this behavior again using relatively simple decision-making models. So all we really wanted to do is determine an effort-based discount value. And so we wanted to model this behavior using some kind of standard discounting functions, so linear, parabolic, and hyperbolic. And the shape of these functions reflect how increasing costs discount or devalue the associated benefits. So in essence, the number of points gained or avoided losing. I suppose, maybe unsurprisingly, what we found is that across all our groups, the same model won, where it was a parabolic function with an independent reward and punishment function, and this is very, very consistent across our 4 groups. So there was no differences in terms of the model that we needed to across the healthy controls and PD patients. However, what was altered was that for reward, this value is very, very similar. The effort discounting parameter similar, suggesting that medicated PD patients were equally as motivated to exert effort in return for reward. But what we were able to see is that this value for punishment was altered. So they were less willing to exert effort, and we were able to replicate our data relatively well using this model. So the model isn't particularly informative in the sense of it just shows again what our data already represented. It's just, I suppose, a nice way of I suppose, showing that the decision-making process wasn't really altered in the PD patients. It's just their sensitivity of what was altered. So summary for this is that loss aversion is consistently present during effort-based decision making. So, I'd say probably in 80–85% of participants, we observe loss aversion. Behaviour and computation analysis revealed that PD patients exerted similar physical effort in return for reward, but were less willing to avoid punishment. Again, we were very hand wavy in this paper, so the underlying mechanism is at best a guess. There's some nice work from Michael Frank, who modeled this kind of work, and actually this part of it fits his basal ganglia models, where when PD patients are medicated, they will show the burst of dopamine associated reward in the direct pathway has been restored, where the in the indirect pathway, the dip of dopamine associated with punishment performance is impaired. I suppose what would be interesting is in this context, and to relate it maybe more to the model, is if we tested PD patients off medication, whether this effect would be flipped, where they'd show reduced sensitivity to reward, but then a similar sensitivity to punishment. We were unable to do this task in PD patients off medication, mainly because it was too effortful. So they just, we tested a couple of patients and they just didn't like it. And so that was, I suppose, more of a technical issue in terms of doing this in off medication. So I suppose overall, the consistency of loss aversion provides a nice explanation to some of my previous work. So we go back to 2015, where we looked at the effects of reward and punishment on motor adaptation. This is just a kind of standard visual displacement task, where we added either reward or punishment to people based on their error, and we're looking at how this affected adaptation. So this is reach direction, and participants were trying to get to 30 degrees. And what we found is that punishment had a greater effect in comparison to reward, and the random positive is an effect control. So reward had a slight effect, punishment had a greater effect. And in the paper, we suggested it maybe had some relationship to loss aversion. I think what we've hopefully shown now is that this is maybe the case, that within a motor context, it does seem that loss aversion is a thing. And it's just kind of final summary overall is that monetary reward and punishment are strong effects on motor performance. In effect, I've done a lot in terms of TDCS and genetics and drugs, and by far and away, if you want to alter performance, use reward or punishment. So that's that. In most people, it has an effect. It has a really, really consistent effect on performance, in comparison to basically any other manipulation I've tried to use in a motor context. So it seems to pay the cost of this enhanced performance, either metabolic or cognitive. There's a measurable difference between reward and punishment, and dopamine seems to alter this relationship. So dopamine does seem to play a role in the amount of loss aversion that we observe. And then kind of looking forward, this work is kind of now looking at some of these questions and some of these tasks in stroke patients, as I've just explained. Got a new study looking at these effects in terms of brain stimulation. So we're assessing the role of GABA during planning, seeing whether reward alters kind of paired pulse stimulation. And some of the work which I've talked to Jason about previously is looking at this in, I suppose, more complex behaviour. So looking at this in terms of sequential movements. And I suppose this becomes more interesting because this is learning-related results or tasks where we find reward has a very strong effect on these sequential actions, so moving towards 8 targets. And what we see is that it leads to increased co-articulation or fusion of these movements. The nice thing is that in this context, reward seems to lead to an improvement in speed, but also smoothness or energetic cost. And we think because of that, when we then remove reward, this enhanced performance is maintained. And so what's been suggested to us, what our kind of general conclusions is that if you want the effect of reward to be long lasting, you not only have to improve performance, but you also have to improve the energetic demands of that movement. If you just improve behavior, then it's going to be a very transient effect. And that's just it. So just like to thank people who actually did this work, and basically all the data and code for these tasks are on our Open Science Framework page for people interested. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joe. I'm going to start off the questions. Just in the study we talked about the stiffness. So I know people like my PhD supervisor Tamar Flash looked at the effect of arm posture on the direction of the stiffness of ellipses. So it tended to point towards the elbow, the direction of the stiff. Did people do anything in terms of picking because I guess they had some freedom in their trajectories to take advantage of this rather than just co-contraction?
So we didn't look at it a huge amount because this is, I suppose, an endpoint robot. So we didn't really have a huge amount in terms of looking at their arm configurations. I suppose that it was quite restrictive because they were quite tight towards the robot and where they were reaching towards. There wasn't a huge amount of I suppose, of flexibility, but we didn't actually assess, unfortunately, their arm configuration. What might be, I suppose, a bit more informative is now the stroke study, we're using an exoskeleton. So we're going to have information in terms of their shoulder and elbow joints. So we can actually start to see whether people do start to make altered configurations of their arm, which may be, as you said, maybe metabolically less demanding as well. But in terms of this data, we don't have the data to know, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the other thing I want to ask is you talked about a little bit at the end about in terms of long-term learning and consolidation and this sort of thing. So is there some sort of general rule in terms of like what's better in terms of reward or punishment? If I want the next day when I've run out of money and I don't want to pay them anymore to do the task, which one would help them to be perform better on the task?
Yeah, so the 2015 paper suggests that reward leads to, and again, there's other people that have shown that as well, like Leo Cohen's labs and others, that there are longer term effects of reward. So I suppose if you do want to have a longer term effect, reward does seem to have a beneficial effect. And again, when we start looking at these in complex behaviours, as long as we saw fusion or co-articulation, then these effects are really amazingly consistent, where we were testing people 7, 14 days and not giving them any more reward, and they were still moving extremely fast. And it's kind of, to us, very confusing why people still moved at this speed. But I suppose the key thing is if you don't show an improvement in the smoothness of the task, then you don't see these improvements. So I think reward can have an instantaneous effect, and this is kind of, hopefully the paper will be coming out soonish, that the reward can have an instantaneous effect but have no effect on retention, but it can also have a long-term effect on retention. And the key difference, it seems to be that you have to change how people perform that task, and it has to be energetically less demanding.
Okay. Great, thanks.
I have a question. It's okay. Thank you very much for the talk. First of all, it was very interesting. And I wanted to ask, actually I had two questions that I'll just ask one because there are more people. So about the PD patients, about your hypothesis about the dopamine, did you try to look at, you can't really monitor the levels of, dopamine after the drugs, but the time from taking the drug or something like that, and this effect on the learning or the decision-making process?
Yeah, so I suppose the honest truth is that our group was pretty messy in terms of the medication that they were on. There wasn't a huge, so in some of our analysis, we did factor in time since last medication, and that didn't seem to have a huge effect. But there wasn't a huge amount of variability. So we often tested people midday, and so it would be nearly all of them would have their medication in the morning and they'd come. So there wasn't a huge amount of variability. So that might be a reason why we didn't see anything. It's annoying that we couldn't really test them off medication. and that's hopefully a goal that we're going to try and do, because again, we're creating a link with the hospital, which hopefully means that we can test people when they're in an inpatient environment, rather than trying to get them to come on public transport and stuff while they're off medication, which they absolutely hate.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Nawim? Yeah.
Thanks. Really cool studies. I have a couple of questions. I'll start off with perhaps the more technical one that'll be shorter, and then followed by a more theoretical one that perhaps there's more discussion point. In the data, that required effort with the index finger, you showed that people take quite a substantial safety margin. And I'm quite interested in that safety margin. I'm wondering whether you could actually see loss aversion in those, loss versus reward trials. So for example, whether people in the loss trials would keep like a higher safety margin. Is that something you noticed in the data?
I'd have to actually go back, because I'm not sure, to be honest. I'd have to actually go back and look, because I'm not sure if Julia really looked at the gap in huge amount of detail. I think because I haven't really thought about that. I suppose we did it more just to ensure that people were performing in the same way. But yeah, I would have thought you'd hopefully see some kind of loss aversion in that context as well. Yeah, so yeah, it's actually something we need to go back and actually have a look, because we haven't looked at it.
Cool. And the other more theoretical question is, Sanjay Menon talks about noise reduction in a very kind of broad sense. And I'm wondering, so, I mean, he does talk about at the neuronal level, right? It's like noise reduction in the neural level, but to me, it's still quite ambiguous what that means. And I'm just wondering, so clearly you're observing like behavioral noise. So there's just less variability in their movements. But I'm also wondering, what do you think is going on in the neuronal level?
Yeah, so, well, I suppose Sanjay provides multiple different possibilities of what this could actually represent. So I suppose my honest answer is we're not sure, and that's why we actually wanted to look at more if there's more of a peripheral explanation for this, and that's why we went towards the kind of stiffness, because I suppose that's a reduction in noise at a very peripheral level, and we don't know actually whether how important stiffness is. So I think this has become for us a really interesting question of that we see a change in stiffness, and we weren't 100% sure at what how many levels does reward influence. And so what actually Olivia's looking at now is the effect of reward and all the different reflexes. So very kind of spinal reflexes all the way to more cortical reflexes. And what he's showing in general is that reward seems to have an effect on the ones which some kind of cortical involvement. It doesn't have a huge amount of involvement in terms of the peripheral thing. So I suppose my answer is I'm not 100% sure what this at a neural level, what this reduction in noise would be representative, but we know that the effects of reward are happening at multiple levels in the motor system.